What's going on, BookTube? Today I'm going to be discussing whether or not guns belong in fantasy, and long story short, they do, but I'm going to explain why. It really comes down to one main reason. This video is not going to be very long, but I do think it's going to be important because I can't have been the only one who was letting their fear of guns and fantasy keep them confined to one little subgenre. For a little bit of background, I essentially stuck to one subgenre of fantasy: swords, dragons, and magic. Like, if it didn't have those three things, I was not reading it. Just to paint a better picture of how extreme this was, Brandon Sanderson is my favorite author of all time. And unlike a lot of people who read his Cosmere, I didn't start with Mistborn. I started with the Stormlight Archives. And from there, I went back to Elantris. I read all his individual novels, and I ended with Mistborn, which, if you have read his books, you know the second era of Mistborn has guns in it. So imagine my surprise when I had read every single one of Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere works. I read Mistborn Generation 1, and I get to Mistborn Generation 2, and there's guns on the cover. My gun hesitancy in fantasy almost made me stop reading right then and there. I considered stopping and not continuing with the Cosmere, and I am so glad I didn't. If it was anyone but Brandon Sanderson himself, I probably wouldn't have finished reading the Cosmere. Like, I wouldn't have picked up that book and read it, and I'm so happy I did. However, that didn't completely solve my hesitancy towards guns and fantasy. After all, this was my favorite author. I thought maybe it's just because I was so invested in the Cosmere, maybe I was letting that override my feelings of guns in the fantasy genre. So I wanted to step out of my comfort zone and read another. And I read Promise of Blood, which is Flintlock fantasy, and loved that as well. And after reading this book, I sat back and reminisced about why I didn't want to read guns in fantasy in the first place. And it really comes down to one big thing. I was scared that guns would take the magic and the fantastical element, the thing that made fantasy, out of the genre. I thought that by adding guns to a magical world, there would no longer be the magic. In a lot of our magical and fantasy worlds, magic has to be learned. It has to be taught. They have to spend years studying it. With a gun, you just pick up, point, and shoot. Like, anybody can be proficient with a gun because there's not a huge learning curve. And I think I was scared about the way this would incorporate into our fantasy worlds. Any sort of advanced technology, for that matter of fact. I thought that all this technology, guns, would take the magic out of fantasy. But I can tell you it does not. In fact, it adds so much more of what an author can do with magic. It adds a whole new aspect to magic. If you limit yourself to swords, dragons, and wizards, you're limiting what stories can be told through those mechanisms. When you add a modern era, or if you add guns, or if you add cars, you're adding something new that can be done with the fantasy genre. My fear, and I think a lot of people's fears of using guns in fantasy, is that it took the magic away. And in actuality, it added so much more to it. I took this lesson of expanding my horizons, about exploring, about stepping outside of my comfort zone and looking into other subgenres that I would have never read. And it's been amazing. I've read Flintlock fantasy, which is the guns. I've read swashbuckler fantasy. I've read horror. I finally read a sci-fi book, which is really exciting because sci-fi is one of my favorite things to watch on TV. And this hesitancy stopped me from reading so many sci-fi books because I couldn't get over the fact that they didn't have dragons, swords, and wizards. So I finally read my first sci-fi book. Guns and fantasy and stepping outside of my comfort zone has shown me what fantasy can be. And all in all, if you're letting your gun hesitancy in fantasy, or if you have found yourself stuck in one little subgenre of fantasy, I can tell you that with how many subgenres I've explored this year, I encourage you to step out of there, read a book that you would have never read before, because it's amazing. There's so much out there, and the hesitancy of stepping outside of your comfort zone is keeping you from so many great stories, from so many new magic systems and new worlds. I can't imagine never leaving that small little world of dragons, swords, and wizards. So that's my discussion on whether or not guns belongs in fantasy. If you haven't subscribed yet, I post videos every Monday and Thursday, so I'll be back soon with more videos. Until then, I hope you're out there exploring cool new worlds and reading cool new books. And until next time, I'll see you soon. Thanks.